Hey everyone, welcome to episode 330 of F-Stop, Collaborate and Listen with your host, Matt Payne. On today's episode, I was super fortunate to host a conversation with the legendary landscape photographer, Bruce Barnbaum. Bruce is known for his black and white prints and evocative images of the Sierra Nevada. Having studied under Ansel Adams, Bruce brings over 50 years of photography experience to our conversation. He is also known for his best-selling book, The Art of Photography, which has sold over 100,000 copies. Today's conversation spans a variety of topics and is sure to delight you. I wanted to also give listeners a heads up that Bruce and I recorded this episode using some screen sharing technology, so for the best experience, I recommend heading over to YouTube. I tried my best to describe the images while he was sharing them throughout the latter part of our conversation, but it is a much richer experience to see them for yourself. Lastly, I want to thank the newest supporters of the podcast on Patreon, including Dario Perizzolo and Michael Blanchett. Thank you both for keeping the podcast alive and ad-free. If you too would like to sustain the podcast financially, please support us by going to patreon.com/fstop and listen. I appreciate all of you who have already stepped up to keep the podcast going for over 6 years now. Okay, let's get to this week's show with Bruce Barnbaum. All right, Bruce Barnbaum, it's great to have you on the podcast.
Well, it's great that you invited me, so I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, of course. Your name has come up in conversations many, many times over the years of me doing this podcast. Lots of people have recommended you for the show, and I'm just super grateful that we could finally make it happen.
I am too, so let's make it happen.
Okay, all right. Well, Bruce, for the few people that are living underneath a rock that aren't familiar with you, why don't you go ahead and tell us a little bit about yourself?
Well, I'm a photographer. I have been a photographer now for over 50 years. It was a rather dramatic change from what I had intended to be as a kid and young adult, which was to be a physicist. I went through school, got a bachelor's and a master's degree in mathematics, together with physics at UCLA, but I never got to the point where I felt that I could get a PhD and be a real dramatic researcher in the field of physics. So I had a job for several years as a computer programmer, working for a company called Aerospace Corporation in the Los Angeles area. And I literally hated the job from the first minute I sat down there. So I just needed to get away from it. And I did not know where to go. Everything that I could think of required going back to school, and I must say I was up to here with school. So that wasn't going to work. But in the meantime, I had built up an interest in photography, just as a hobby. It was basically the result of backpacking, hiking in the Sierra Nevada mountains in California, a fantastic mountain range, and it grew from there. And what really was the turning point was a happenstance situation in 1968. First of all, let me just say that I got my master's degree in 67, so I was on the job for about a year or so, at the point of the story I'm about to tell you. There was a major environmental battle going on between the Sierra Club, one of the most well-known environmental organizations, and Walt Disney Enterprises. And the battle was this. Sequoia National Park in the southern Sierra Nevada mountains was shaped like a giant fat horseshoe. And in the center of that horseshoe was a valley named Mineral King Valley. Mineral King, the valley, the lowest portion of the valley, is at 7,200 feet. The mountains on the east side of the valley rise to over 12,000 feet, on the west side to nearly 11,000 feet. The Sierra Club wanted Mineral King to be a portion of Sequoia National Park. Walt Disney Enterprises wanted to create the largest ski resort in North America right there. So the battle lines were drawn. Learning about that, I was very much in favor of that section being included in Sequoia National Park. By that time, I had learned a little bit of photography. I was making my own negatives and even my own photographs in my bathroom and bedroom darkroom in the apartment I lived in Los Angeles. And I went to the Mineral King area on the 4-day July 4th extended weekend in 1968. Made photographs on a number of trails and other places, and then did a very bold thing. I called the Sierra Club, which was located in San Francisco, and asked if they could use any photographs of Mineral King, fully expecting them to say that Ansel Adams is on their board of directors and they're loaded with photographs. But instead they said, that would be fantastic. We don't have anything. So I said, okay, under those circumstances, let me send you some 8x10 black and white images that I had made and was going to print, which I did. And the only thing I said was, if you send any of these out for any purpose, just let me know and I will resupply the image or the images that you had sent out so that you have a supply of those. And that was basically the last I heard of that. I sent those images probably by the end of July, perhaps early August of that year. And it was in late September of that year, I get a letter from Britannica Encyclopedia. And in those days, if you bought a set of the encyclopedias, for the next 10 years, you would get what they called a yearbook, which was kind of a compilation of what Britannica thought were the major important issues of that year. And the letter that I got from Britannica said, could we have permission to use your photograph of Mineral King that appeared in the New York Times? And I was dumbfounded. I was thinking, what's this all about? And I immediately contacted the Sierra Club and said, what is this all about? And they said, oh, we're sorry, but right after you had sent us the photographs, we got contacted by the New York Times, and they wanted to do a major article about the Battle of Mineral King. And we sent them some photographs in addition to the interviews that we did with them. And I asked for a name of somebody at the New York Times. They gave me the name. I contacted that person. He told me when it was published. I was able, in the Los Angeles area where I was living at the time, to get a back copy of that issue. And it was the Sunday, August 18th issue. And I had no idea where it would be. And the Sunday edition, is huge. I'm paging through the paper, and in the magazine section, I turned a page, and suddenly there's a 2-page photograph of Mineral King, and it's my photograph. The article began on the right-hand page, kind of in the lower left corner, first few words or sentences, and then it went on for about 6 or 8 more pages, which talked about the entire battle and included some maps and some photographs. And even a couple more photographs of those were mine as well. And it gave me name recognition. It said photographed by Bruce Barnbaum. And I called back to the fellow at the New York Times and said, I really want to thank you for using my photographs and giving me name credit, but I do have a question. Do I get paid for this? And he wrote back and he said, well, yeah, you do.
Of course.
We have absolutely no information about where you live or whatever. I am quite sure that the only thing that I wrote on the back of those images that I sent to the Sierra Club was my name and perhaps what trail or what location within Mineral King I made the photograph. So at that point, I gave the fellow from the New York Times my address and everything. And several weeks later, I see an envelope in my mailbox in the apartment where I was living. And the return address was from the New York Times. I opened it right there, and there was a check in the mail. It was not a very big check, but there was a check in the mail. And I remember standing there looking at this check at the mailbox and thinking, I could go camping and get paid for this? That's for me. I'm going into photography. That is literally the story of how I got into photography. It happened right there. So I've been in it ever since. Basically, at the company where I was working, I, in effect, stopped working. It took them about 18 months before they noticed, and they suggested that I leave my desk, and I did. And the rest is history. Photography worked well for me. So.
Yeah, and since then, you've produced several books, and you've made quite a name for yourself as a black and white master printer, is what people usually refer to you as, and I'm particularly interested in the books that you've produced, especially the books that you've incorporated some music that goes along with them, and I would love for you to tell us a little bit about how that particular mixture of mediums came about, and perhaps tell us a little bit about how that transforms the viewing experience.
Well, actually, there's a lot right there. We could go on for days with what you just asked. I feel that there's a lot of relationships, not only within the arts, but between the arts and sciences and basically everything in life. John Muir said it best. He said, when you try to isolate something, you realize that everything is hitched together to everything else in the universe. And he was absolutely correct. He, by the way, was the fellow who started the Sierra Club. So, a naturalist. Anyway, I feel that there's a lot with education itself. I feel the main aspect of education should be teaching people how to learn, not the subject matter itself, and it shouldn't really be a vocational thing. It has to be to an extent, but basically learning how to learn. And I think that there's a lot of relationships that go on here. I know that getting into photography, I was benefited by my math background and understanding the Ansel Adams zone system, which I'm sure every photographer has heard about. I read about it and understood it right away because it was really quite simple. Many instructors make it incredibly difficult to understand, but there's no need for that. It is a simple system. And I also felt that there's a great deal of relationships within the arts. And for instance, very often when I'm looking at a photograph or even a scene that leads to a photograph, I will hear music. And I feel there is a relationship. There's certain things in the shapes, the forms, the rhythms of the thing I'm looking at that just brings music to my mind. In a complementary fashion, often I will listen to a piece of music and I will see imagery. So the two, to me, are closely related. And it came through in my first book that was titled Visual Symphony. I came up with that title. There were 4 segments to the book for different bodies of work, which struck me as being very similar to the typical 4 movements of a standard classical symphony. Just the title came through to me. Years later, after having had that book published, I had many, many more images, and I was thinking again along musical lines, and I thought of the term tone poems. And at that same time, I had met a pianist in the Seattle area, very fine pianist, Judith Cohen. She had just produced 3 brand new CDs. She had produced others in the past, but she had just recorded 3 new ones. And I was at a large party, congratulatory party for her. And while she was sitting at the piano playing, I was suddenly thinking, as long as I have this title for this alleged book that I wanted to put out called Tone Poems, or alleged set of books, why not include the music as well? And after she finished playing, I went over to her, introduced myself, and told her about this book project I have in mind and the title. And I said, would you be interested in doing a collaboration? And she said, that would be wonderful. And quite honestly, it was like hearing yes to a marriage proposal. It was just remarkable. And it just went on from there. And we did produce 2 books. I had initially hoped for 4, but sales were not enough to bring it past the 2 that were produced. But Judith and I chose music that we felt emotionally went along with the imagery in the books. So that's really what that's all about. And it was not just Judith. It was, in some cases, not only her as soloist, but there were some duets and several trios with members of the Seattle Symphony Orchestra.
That's fantastic. Yeah, I think you definitely have a lot going on there in terms of pairing music and visual art. I feel like that's super ingenious. I'm not a musician myself, but I could see how pairing music with a book would be a really interesting experience. And I'm wondering if you could maybe talk about like what that process was like in terms of figuring out how to sequence the images in the book with the musical score, because it seems I'm like, which one came first?
The images came first. I mean, that was really it. And basically, I chose most of the music from records, old records, vinyl records that are new again, and CDs that I had. And with the help of Judith and the recording engineer, Al Swanson, who was the recording engineer for all of the music that was recorded by the Seattle Symphony Orchestra. He was not just a recording engineer. He went well beyond that because he could read the music. And so I was there at the recording sessions for the music that we decided to use to represent the various sections of the book. So it was a learning experience for me. It was a learning experience for all of us. But it was a wonderful experience. I mean, doing all this and putting it together and eventually coming up with a book that included a CD of all the recorded music for each of the books. And I must say, and this will probably surprise a lot of people, that I personally cannot look at the imagery of the book and simultaneously listen to the music. I cannot do that. If I'm looking at the book and really looking at the pictures, the music disappears. If I'm listening to the music, I'm simply turning pages, okay? I know people who can do both. I can listen to the music and picture the images, but I can't be looking at them. I could picture the images and hear the music.
Interesting.
But I cannot do both. But I think one of the finest compliments that I ever got on the book was by a musician who had the book, and he opened it up one day and put on the CD and was looking and listening, and he suddenly said, "This isn't working. This just is not working at all." And he suddenly realized he was looking at the first set of images and listening to the second set of music. And when he got those meshed together, he said, "Aha, this does work together." And that made me really feel good, you know. So there was a clear relationship and the imagery that was chosen.
Maybe that's why we haven't seen a bunch of that done before, just because it's not easy to do both at the same time.
Well, there was even a third thing. Those two books I published myself. And the reason that I did was that I had gone to publishers and they liked the concept, but they seemed totally flummoxed. Do we put this in a bookstore under photography? Do we put it under music? They just really didn't know where to place it, I guess, in the Dewey Decimal System. And they backed off. They liked the idea, but did not really seem to know how to put it into effect. So I basically just did it myself. And therein lay the problem, because I don't have distribution and all those other things, which are really the business side of putting a book together.
Yeah, no doubt. I totally get that. Well, let's shift gears completely, because I want to capitalize the time I have with you, and I would love for you to tell us about your approach to composition. And I'm guessing you're gonna share with us some images that you've got. We got some screen sharing. You're the first person to do this, so I'm kind of excited for that. So the experience is going to be a little different for those on YouTube, but you'll just have to bear with us if you're listening.
I'm putting this one on because has been throughout my career my most popular photograph. It's the one that has sold the most. Let me just, as an aside, say sales really has very little to do with quality of an image, because there could be wonderful photographs that don't sell, and there could be poor photographs that sell very well. But this is certainly a well-known photograph of mine, made in 1973, titled Basin Mountain Approaching Storm. This is on the east side of the Sierra Nevada mountains, made in November. What did I see? You asked about composition here. Well, what I saw, let's go to the scene itself. I saw mountains, a set of mountains that are rising almost 2 miles above where I was standing, that are being overcome by clouds and an approaching storm. There were some clouds that were basically overhead. Those are the dark ones at the top, and a set of clouds coming over the mountains. And what I wanted for something in the foreground was something that was just pleasant. And just north of the town of Bishop, there are several large ranches. And I found this cowboy fence right at the edge of a road. I parked my car right there, basically pulled out my tripod, my 4x5 camera, set it up basically right at the trunk of the car across the road, and you just see a little piece of that road in the lower right corner, and the cowboy fence, the corral fence behind it, and Basin Mountain straight in the middle in front of that. And basically what I saw from a compositional point of view was a whole series of stripes, dark shadows in the foreground, a bright field behind it, darker shadows, bright sunlit mountains with snow on them, clouds, sky, and dark clouds at the top. So there was a compositional unity in this linearity that I saw within the scene. I made one exposure, and that was it. And that's usually what I do. Some people will make several exposures, and today, of course, digitally, people make multitudes of exposures. Working with a 4x5 camera, except if I feel that either things are changing in a way that maybe a second exposure would be better, the light has changed in a situation like this, maybe the clouds, whatever, had changed in a way that made another exposure seem like it could be even better. Or if I felt that I somehow made a mistake myself, maybe I bumped the tripod at a key moment or something like that, I usually confine myself to one exposure, and that's it. And that's the case over here.
With this image, I'm curious because this was shot on 4x5 film. I'm wondering how much darkroom work did you have to do in terms of teasing out some of those tonality differences in terms of the what you were talking about compositionally. You've got, for those listening, it's really interesting to see the from bottom to top. It's very dark, it's bright, it's dark, it's bright, and it's dark again, all the way from bottom to top, like these gradated layers. And I'm curious just how much work you had to do to kind of emphasize some of those tones.
In 2 words, a lot. To be more specific, this photograph requires a great deal of darkroom work. During the basic exposure, you see all those grasses and bushes in the foreground. I'm dodging that or preventing light from hitting that and making it lighter during the basic exposure. And then after that basic exposure, while I'm lightening the bottom, basically almost like you would do if you were playing the piano, I'm just running my fingers back and forth, following the contours of the shadows, you might say, throughout that basic exposure. And then I'm giving more exposure to the top half and more to the top third. And then I come in and I burn those rugged hills on the center left below the mountains, and I burn that mountainside on the center right below the clouds. So there's manipulation kind of all over the place. The light was there, but from a practical point of view, when you look at the bottom half, the scene, the landscape that was lit, it was actually still quite a bit darker than the sky itself and the sunlit mountainside that is covered with snow. So the upper part has to be brought back into balance with the lower part. So that's kind of a little bit of what goes into making this photograph. What you have to realize, if you're a photographer, is, you look at the scene, you look at what is out there, but the only thing that a camera records, and when I say a camera, whether it's using film or digital sensors, what is recorded are simply light levels. That's the only thing that film or digital sensors understand. They do not understand a face, a mountain, a building, anything else. They just see light levels. So as a photographer, you have to look at the scene and look through it to the levels of light, and you have to also be aware of what manipulative options you have in the darkroom or on the computer. And I felt that I was able to work through, you might say, the direct failings of light and be able to lighten areas that could be too dark and darken areas that would be too light to create the final photograph. I hope that answers the question.
It does, yeah. And, I'm not personally a fan of rules in terms of composition, but I can't help but notice that this particular image does seem to kind of adhere to the rule of thirds. You've got that nice fence at the bottom third, you've got the dark clouds at the top third, and then you've got the mountains kind of sandwiched in between, which I'm curious, when you're in the field composing, are you using rules, or is it more just in terms of what kind of pleases your mind's eye in terms of what you're seeing, or kind of what's your approach to combining the elements in the frame to make them suit your vision?
Well, first of all, let me say the way you articulated rule of thirds here is not the way I've ever understood it. Usually what people are talking about is placing a center of interest kind of a third of the way in and a third of the way up or down. And that's what they generally mean by rule of thirds. But I think that rule and every other one is about as useless and meaningless as anything could be. It was the last thing I was thinking about when I made this photograph or any other. I actually, in fact, go farther. Some people say, well, it's good to learn the rules, and it kind of helps you get toward a good composition, but then you could kind of throw them out. I think it's better not to ever know the rules, whatever those stupid rules are, because then you don't have to even concern yourself with avoiding them, which is really what happens to a lot of people. They try to actively avoid something. I think it basically has to be a gut feeling, and that is something looks good in the scene, whatever the scene is, and you have to be able to translate that scene in your mind's eye to the image that you're going to place in front of somebody, and see, number one, can I do it? And does it say what I want it to say? And I think those are the important things, and those are devoid of any rules whatsoever.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. But I will say, just looking at this particular image, for me, what makes it work so well is the way that you've harmoniously placed objects or light in the frame in terms of balancing out the elements. So you've got your hero, the subject, the mountain in the center, but on either side of it, you have darker mountains, and then you've got the dark clouds at the top, which keep the eye from going out the frame that way, and you've got the dark fence at the bottom, which prevent the eye from going that way, and then you've got fence posts kind of pointing up into the scene, which help guide the eye of this is what you want to look at. So for me, whether or not you use the rule of thirds or not, you definitely employed some compositional skills to lead the viewer to the right place.
Great. If that's how you feel about it, then that's great. You know what that tells me? That tells me that this photograph is successful in your eyes, and I'm pleased to hear that.
What else do you got? You got like a whole film strip down there.
Let me jump to a photograph I made the very next day. This photograph was made just prior to a little weekend workshop that I was doing for the Sierra Club back in those days, 1973, and I skipped breakfast in order to make this shot. Later that day, that storm, those clouds did come in, and we were hit with some rain and snow and sleet. And the next morning, from the town of Bishop on the east side of the Sierra where we were, I suggested that we drive south along the eastern front of the mountains to the town of Lone Pine, about 60 miles south, and maybe we could get out of the bad weather. And the next day we drove down there, and I made this photograph the very next day.
Ooh, nice.
This was the most spectacular cloud I had ever seen or have ever seen ever since then. This was made the next early afternoon. The Sierra Nevada mountains are actually off to the right. You just see a slope of it just starting to go up toward the lower right. On the left, you see a big mound. It's a portion of what's known as the Alabama Hills, which are nowhere near as high as the Sierra, but they look much higher here. And then this incredible Sierra wave cloud, which is the type of lenticular cloud that is often seen in the Owens Valley, which is just below the summits of the Sierra Nevada mountains on the east side, caused by just the extraordinary weather conditions created by the mountains themselves. So here is a photograph made the very next day. It was quite a remarkable weekend of photography for me.
Tell us kind of what you were thinking compositionally and why you feel like the image works.
I'm not even sure what I was thinking compositionally. At this point, I just saw this stupendous cloud, the likes of which I had never seen, and the way the sunlight was hitting it and subtly showing off. You could see some of these lines along here, and of course this major line that comes across here. But I just could not believe the shape of this cloud and how it was lit. It was just completely unearthly.
I love it. For me, compositionally, I think you've done an interesting job here of, again, keeping the viewer encased in the frame. I think that's something a lot of photographers fail to do with their images, is they don't give the eye somewhere to rest and to, continue to explore the frame. And what you've done here, probably through some selective dodging and burning, is you've made it to where the eye keeps coming back to that cloud and the way it kind of swirls around at the center of the frame, and you are drawn into those textures and those lines. So I think that's what makes this image work for me.
Wonderful. Great. I thank you. Let me jump from that to just a few other photographs that are ones that I think are ones that I'm known for. So let me jump to this. This is fallen sequoias, photograph made in 1977. I was in Sequoia National Park. My wife was actually there because she was doing environmental work for an agency that she was working with, environmental agency. And my job was to just wander around that day. And I came across this scene, which is actually something that had been there for 9 years. In 1968, a giant sequoia tree just fell over one day. It was not a windy day, it was a pleasant day, and the tree fell over. On its way down, it hit another sequoia tree and knocked it over. The very next day, right in the same area, another sequoia tree fell over, and it too hit another tree on the way down. And there it was, because it was in a national park, nothing was touched, nothing was moved. I came upon this on a foggy day 9 years later, and there it was. I walked around the whole set of fallen, angled trees just to see. This was just so stupendous. To give you an idea, that tree that is clearly the prime one at the extreme angle is approximately 14 feet in diameter. That'll give you an idea of the scale of what you're looking at over here. And it was very fortunate to be a foggy day. I didn't have bright spots of sunlight and shade. And back in the distance, the trees just kind of faded away into the fog. So I was able to make this. I circled this whole destruction area, you might call it, where the trees had fallen, and finally chose this location because I liked the relationship of the big tree that's up at the top and all of the smaller branches and things down in the lower right. They just seemed to echo one another. And I thought this was where the photograph had to be made. It was quite a dynamic situation. I have no idea how long it lasted, for how many years after this, or if it's even still there today. But this was in 1977.
That's fantastic. Yeah, I mean, obviously fog is incredible in terms of helping to isolate your subject, but what's powerful about this image for me is just the diagonals, and like you said, you've got these, trees that are upright, and then you have this other one that's just boom, cuts right through the scene. And then it has this other tree laying on top of it that just anchors that bottom lower third, and then you have the other trees at the bottom right that anchor the other lower third. So it's a very harmonious image in that regard as well.
This photograph, which was made from the back steps of the state capitol building in California, in Sacramento, California, looking out to an arboretum that's right behind the state capitol. It started out as a foggy morning, and when I stepped to that location, the sun was just starting to break through the clouds. I actually made this photograph as a test. It was a test of a new development system that a good friend and workshop co-instructor, Ray McSavany, had discovered by using very, very dilute solution of the codec developer HC110. And he found that by using extremely dilute solutions, he could really retain contrast in a very high contrast situation. So you could pretty much imagine, I'm looking at the shadowed side of these trees, and here the sun is actually coming through, and you could see on those two very prominent branches that head toward the upper right of the image, the sun is actually right between them. Okay, so it's an extremely contrasty situation, and yet using the very dilute solution that Ray had discovered, I was able to maintain contrast, and in fact actually lower the contrast to the point where everything, even the shaded side of the trees, looked very bright and luminous in a situation that well exceeded 10 zones on the light meter scale.
Yeah, I mean, most of the time people talk about the knock on film being it doesn't have enough dynamic range, but in this particular situation, it's obvious that you've captured almost the full spectrum of dynamic range that's within this image.
Well, not only that, it doesn't even go to a black. So it captured or retained it. First of all, many people, let's say, do not realize that film actually contains zones, a range up into the teens, generally about 16 to 18 zones, not the 10 zones that most people feel is there. So by exposing the negative the way I did and developing it the way I did, I was compacting a number of zones, all of which were on the film, to a very easily printable small range of tonalities. And that's how I was able to make this photograph. The reason that I made this photograph, as I said, was a test to see if this extremely dilute solution would actually develop a negative and reduce the contrast in a very high contrast situation to one that was printable. And this one proved it to me, that it worked. I actually thought there would be very little application for it, but I was very happy to know that if I ever ran into something like that, I could use this particular technique to rein in the contrast. Now, I think that almost everybody could relate to the contrast in this kind of a scene. So let me jump to something that I ran into merely 2 weeks after developing this negative and making the first print, as you see here, to a situation that became perhaps the heart of my photography. And let me say, before I put this next photograph up on the screen, let me say that it was developed in exactly the same way as this image in Capitol Park in Sacramento. It's hard to imagine that the previous image and this image were developed identically. You can easily understand the dynamic range that was there in the previous image in that arboretum. Here, the dynamic range actually exceeded that of the film. And what I did in making this particular photograph is I took several meter readings that showed me the range just being beyond the film's capability, and I exposed for the brightest highlight, which is basically right directly in the center of this image, with this dark, massive wall below it in Antelope Canyon, which is now a real tourist trap. But at that point in 1980, when I first saw this, was completely unknown. So I made this photograph after seeing it for the first time January 1st without a camera late in the afternoon. I brought my camera in the next morning and made this photograph. And I will say that this, from the moment I saw it the previous day to this day, is my own absolute favorite photograph. And let me explain why. I mentioned earlier that I had hoped to become a great researcher in physics, specifically in particle physics, subatomic physics, and or cosmological physics at the galactic and intergalactic levels. But I never made it. I never got to that point. I just felt I was over my head. But when I walked into Antelope Canyon, I felt that I walked into a force field, which was precisely what I would have been researching at the subatomic level and what I would have been researching at the intergalactic level. You're basically dealing with force fields. And this photograph, to me, brought me right back to my roots, because at the subatomic level, that large black form, to me, represented, for instance, the nucleus of an atom, and what's swirling around it are the electrons that swirl around the nucleus of the atom. At the galactic level, that black form is the black hole at the center of our galaxy, and what's swirling around it are the stars that make up the Milky Way galaxy, Andromeda, and so many other spiral galaxies. And we know now that there's effectively an infinite number of those out in the universe. So this photograph just brought my whole life together. And not only did I make this photograph, but then I started looking for and finding other slit canyons, as I call them immediately, and have since called them, not slot canyons, which reminds me too much of Las Vegas, but slit canyons, because it's like a slit in the earth. And I started making other photographs. So here's one I made in Lower Antelope Canyon that I call the wall with two ridges. And here quickly is another that I made in a place called Peach Canyon. And I just call it Hollows and Points Peach Canyon. And quite honestly, to this very day, I don't know of anybody who actually did any serious body of photographic work in these canyons prior to the ones that I did. So basically, I feel that I pretty well opened up this whole field of photographic endeavor. You know, you've always heard the term, well, everything's been photographed. But the fact is that these canyons, to my understanding, had never been photographed before I did. But now they've been photographed heavily because they're very touristy areas.
I actually just did a private tour of a slot canyon over there about a week ago now. It's incredible. It's an amazing experience to photograph them. So thank you for pioneering slit canyon photography, because it's definitely one of my favorite subjects, although to your point, now it's becoming increasingly more difficult to find one that's not polluted with humans.
Exactly. I mean, these places I photographed largely from the time I discovered them, 1980. Actually, walked into Antelope Canyon on January 1st, 1980, which was a hell of a way to start a decade. And I photographed them pretty much through 1998. But I've stayed away from that area now because the press of people and the kind of circus that goes on with it is more than I could take. These places are really quite sacred to me, but I don't think I'll ever go back into those in that area again because I'm just too emotionally attached, you might say, to these to witness the circus that's going on today. So I don't want to be part of it. So I've gone to other areas. I had my time there. I'm very happy that I had my time there. But I just figured by 1998 it was time to move on and go to other places. So I've discovered other places and other photographs. Here's one that I made in a canyon that I've been backpacking and doing workshops in these canyons for quite some time. This is a wall detail in Wolverine Canyon in southern Utah, one of the tributaries of the Escalante River, which is a tributary itself of the Colorado River. And I've been doing backpacking workshops, taking people into these canyons. So here's a photograph that struck me as kind of a bas-relief of an Indian head. Some people see in this a bas-relief. They all see a bas-relief of a head. Some people felt it was an Egyptian princess.
I was going to say it looks like Cleopatra. Maybe this is a good segue, though. I wanted to ask you, because it's come up now over and over again in these images you're showing, that a lot of your images seem to have some kind of relation to something else that's maybe representative or an abstract or a metaphor. And I'm curious, how do you identify the subjects that you point your camera out? Like, what goes through your mind when you're walking this canyon and the Wolverine, tributary, and you see this? Like, how did you know that? Aha, this is a photo.
I was wandering along. This was actually during a workshop. The entire group was walking up this canyon. I happened to be in the front at this point. People are stopping. They're photographing along the way. I was there with the students and with the co-instructor. And at one point, and in this particular location, it's not quite a slit canyon by any means. You could step back from one wall to the other. They're probably 50 or 60 feet apart at this point. But I'm walking along, and I just looked up on this one wall, and there was this large bas-relief that face and neck are probably in the range of 12 to 15 feet high. Okay, so it was quite a large structure, you might say, on this wall, and it just immediately struck me as a profile. If you've ever seen, of course, the old Indian head nickels, that's actually what it struck me as initially. Mm-hmm. So I call it just Indian head bas-relief. I'm perfectly happy with Cleopatra or anything else like that. But beyond the face that you see there, as you go toward the lower left, there's almost echoes of it. And then surrounding it, from the lower right of the image, over the top of the head and up to the upper left, there's just like a frame. It almost framed itself. And I set up my camera and chose the lens that just encompassed exactly what I saw. So this is actually 100% full frame of what I saw and photographed there. And it was just an astonishing feel, to see this. And in fact, what I did, because the whole group was there, I could have just stood there and just photographed this and walked away. I just called out to the whole group and I was saying, come over here, you've got to see this. So everybody photographed this. I didn't point out anything. I just said, look up there. And everybody immediately saw this profile So a lot of people photographed it in color. I think most people photographed it in color. And I photographed it this way. But I also did photograph it digitally in color as well. But I really like the black and white better.
So you seem to be drawn to images that evoke something else in terms of it's more than just representational of what you're looking at. It seems that there's often some sort of metaphor woven into the compositions that you see, and I'm curious if that's something that you've just come to become better at over time, or if that's always been something that you had a talent for, or maybe you could talk about how that works for you.
Well, let me say that what you just said kind of goes along with a fairly well-known statement by Minor White, who said, we should photograph something for what it is and for what else it is, which I think is a wonderful statement on his part. The what else it is, the abstract underpinnings. You go to those several photographs I made in Antelope Canyon, or the other canyons, where those are specifically meant to show forces in nature. I mean, think of a bar magnet held under a sheet of paper where iron filings are sprinkled over the paper, and you see the lines of force that the magnet creates. The several photographs that I showed prior to this one, to me, are exactly those lines of force. And that's what I saw and felt when I first walked into Antelope Canyon. I did not feel that I had walked into a sandstone canyon. I literally felt that I had walked into a force field. And I remember thinking, I could have been studying this sort of stuff theoretically, and now I'm in it. I literally felt I was in a force field. And I was thinking, my God, I am so far ahead of those researchers. They're researching this stuff. I'm in it. That literally went through my mind. So that, was part of my thinking. And that's why that image that I showed you, I'll put it back up, just rang. It resonated with me so thoroughly, and still does, that it was kind of the embodiment of wrapping my whole life together. Now I'm in photography, but this really harkened back to my thoughts that I could be a great researcher in the forces of nature at the subatomic or galactic level.
That's awesome, Bruce. That's great that you've been able to tie photography back into your early passions in physics. I think, and I find this happens often with some of my favorite photographers, that they're able to pair their love of photography with some other love of a natural science or a theoretical science, and either whether it be geology, or it could even be music, or it could be painting. I've always found that my favorite photographers, it's not just about photography, it's always about something else that just kind of gets woven into it that really elevates it. And I'm curious if that's something that you've recognized as well.
Oh, yeah. For sure I've recognized that. And on this particular photograph, it hit me over the head. It wasn't something I had to think about. It was there when I first walked into Antelope Canyon, and then I came across this particular structure, and I remember almost out loud, but I couldn't even speak, basically saying to myself, there's my first photograph tomorrow. Tomorrow, that next morning, we were going to be driving back home, but I said, no, I've got to come back here and make this photograph and maybe a few others with the remaining sheets of film I had with me. It was on kind of a trip together with friends, and never expected to find anything like this. And I still had a few sheets of unexposed film, and I used them up that next morning and then headed home.
Right, that makes sense. I want to move us along to another subject that I think is going to take a little bit of time, hopefully. And there's a lot to unpackage with my question, and I'm going to let you kind of take it because I think there's a lot of things that you have woven into this concept. So I would love for you to tell us about your upcoming book project.
Okay. I'm working on a major book project that never was even intended to be a book project. And like virtually anything that I've ever done photographically, it came about by happenstance. I don't think I've ever conceived of a project in advance and said, oh, that's something I want to do, and then go ahead and do it. I have found that I have started doing something and then realized that it was a self-contained project as I was partway through it, and then completed that project. Here's what happened. Back in 2019, we are now in 2023, I decided that I was going to go through all of my black and white negatives, 4x5 negatives that I had made basically from the beginning of my career, or actually to be more precise, from right after I took a workshop under Ansel Adams in 1970 in Yosemite National Park. I would start right after that workshop and go through all of my negatives with the idea that along the way I may have overlooked something that was good, but I didn't recognize it at the time. Or perhaps I had tried printing something and failed at that time, perhaps with my lack of darkroom skills then, or the photographic enlarging papers that existed then, which were the graded papers. And today we have variable contrast papers, so you could print different parts of any image at different contrast levels, So there's much greater flexibility. And I thought, along the way, I may be able to actually resurrect an old image or two that I either overlooked or could not successfully print. What surprised me was that I kept finding more and more images. Now, here's what happened. Right at the end of 2019, I had two major operations. I had my right and then my left hip replaced. They were bone on bone, and I had just come back from several workshops, including a backpack workshop, that made it very, very difficult to walk. So I had, in the space of 5 weeks, both hip joints replaced. Well, that, of course, laid me up. And at that point, I had nothing to do but review old negatives. Actually, it wasn't the negatives that I was reviewing. It was actually the contact prints made directly from the negatives. So 4x5, low contrast contact prints. And to my amazement, I was putting one after another aside. There were a lot of nothings in between. I mean, some photographs that looked so horrible that I was just baffled by why I even made the exposure. A lot of junk, but there was a lot of really good stuff. And at some point, I started realizing I had enough over here that I got to do something with it. I've got to do something. And the idea of a book came about. And with the idea of a book, I thought, well, I need titles for the photographs and perhaps captions. And with the growing number of images with titles and with captions, other thoughts came to mind, and some thoughts about photography that exceeded that of a caption came to mind. So I started writing essays, and eventually I put together a book that I'm hoping to get published, that I'm titling Discoveries of a Lifetime. It started with the images from my entire career that I discovered So these were discoveries of a lifetime. And now I'm adding to them or substituting new images that I may make today, tomorrow, the next day. And I'm trying to keep it into some reasonable number of images, but I will have to admit at this point that it may have already exceeded all reasonable limits, because I now have a book of approximately 160 images in mind. That's a large book.
We produce a fine art photography book every year for this competition I created, and I think 160 is about where we're at, something like that, and it is a lot. You're right.
Yeah, it may be too much, but what I've been doing is going over it and just trying to think, which one should I take out, or which two should I take out, or three. And at this point, I've gotten to the point where I don't want to take any of them out. But I'm trying to limit myself to the idea that if I get a new photograph that I really like, I'm only going to consider putting it in at the expense of one that's currently in. So I have to draw a line somewhere, and I don't know if I should have drawn that line long ago or not. I'm trying to evaluate that. Let me just jump to the first one. This is one I call the Elegant Dune Ridge. This is made in Death Valley way back in 1976. The idea behind the images in this book is that none of the images for the book are ones that I have ever had published or have ever displayed in a gallery. I have ruled out any, like the ones that I previously showed you, that have been both in a gallery, perhaps in a museum, perhaps published in a book or magazine. So these are ones that have never been shown, you might say. And I feel that I have enough of them, and to me they are of sufficient quality that they stand up with what I have up to now done. And I believe that together with the captions and with the essays as a full package, this book could really become my magnum opus. It would be very pleasing for me to be known for this book if it ever gets published. So that's the issue. So let me jump from image to image, and if you have any questions, Matt, when I show the image, why don't you just jump in if you have any questions or if you have any comments on them?
Well, I mean, first of all, this Death Valley image is fantastic. It's not been published before, so I think it's going to be exciting for anyone that follows your work to get their hands on this book, because it's going to be like a greatest hits album that is of images that have never been seen before, which I think is awesome.
Well, thank you. I think so too, I must admit. But I just have to see if it can be published. I do have a prospective publisher at the moment, but the publisher, small publishers, mainly publish magazines, definitely wants to do the book. But whether they have the time or the full knowledge of doing it is questionable. So at this point, it's tentative, but at some point it will go into a crowdfunding effort, and we'll see if the book can be published. And this one is not an old one. This was actually made last year during a workshop, and it's a photograph of my favorite mountain, which is Mount Whitney, the highest peak in the Sierra Nevada mountains.
It's a fresh take on a classic scene, is how I would describe it to people who can't see it. I think everyone has probably seen that jagged ridgeline of Mount Whitney from the Owen Valley before. With this particular image, it's got a lot more visual interest. In the lower 2/3 of the image are not Mount Whitney, and it's actually quite interesting.
This was kind of an unusual situation. It was a clear sky. I often will look at mountains and look at, kind of an exciting cloudy sky there, but there were no clouds looking to the west, which is the direction I'm looking here. But there were clouds at sunrise between the sun and these mountains. And those clouds created the shadows on those ridges that run up toward the upper left in the photograph. And to me, the Alabama hills, these rock piles that I was standing on in the foreground, had not yet received the sun, which were coming up over the Inyo Mountains that were directly behind me. And then there were shadows on the mountains that had already been hit by the sun, but now were partially occluded by some of those clouds. And then the only peak and its stilettos just to the left that were being hit by full sun was the summit of Whitney and the pinnacles to the left of it. So it was a very, very exciting moment. I had to work as fast as I could when I saw this to take advantage of the situation. That would be a new one that would be in the new book.
Yeah, there's a lot of drama in this particular image that you've just put up. Again, for people who can't see if they're listening, I would kind of describe it as a desert scene with a pool of water in kind of the lower left third, center of the frame almost, with this kind of dark sandstone butte leading up into some really dramatic clouds at the top of the frame, and then at the bottom of the frame you've got these nice lines and radiation of light and like a couple of little plants. It's a very pleasing scene to the eye.
This photograph is made at a fairly well-known tourist spot known as the Horseshoe Bend of the Colorado River. So this is on the plateau at Bend. And the photograph, I'd have to go back and look it up. I think it was made in about 1990 or so. But I was up on the plateau, and there was just this wonderful storm that was just finishing up, and the sun had actually just set directly behind the butte that sticks up in the center of the image. And yet there was this beautiful pool right in front of it, and it was just calm as could be. It looks like with the clouds like that, the pool should be roiling, but it basically was calm. And it was just a wonderful situation to encounter. Yes. So let me jump to something else in the same book.
Yeah, it looks like maybe captured in redwoods or sequoia. You've got a footbridge in the foreground leading out, that perspective line heading out into the center of the frame, left half of the frame with trees and undergrowth, and it's nice color tonality, and it's one of those images, that it's like, oh, I could see myself standing right there.
Well, in fact, it's neither redwoods nor sequoias. This is actually about 4 miles up the road from my home. I live in a mountain valley in the North Cascades, north of Seattle, and this is just a bridge across a small stream that just kind of leads you right into the forest. And of course, the forests up here in the Pacific Northwest are just as awesome as any could be anywhere. So this is actually the first image of a second portion of the book. I mentioned that the book has images and captions. The way the book is to be laid out, every image is on the right-hand page. The left-hand page of that open book is the title and the caption. And then when I segue from one set of images to another set of images, that's where I'm placing the essays between those segues. So this would actually be the first image of a group of photographs that feature trees and forests after an initial group of images that feature just wider landscapes.
As we're looking at these images, I wanted to weave in another topic, and I'm curious if it relates to this Magnus opus, so to speak, of your images. As I know that you had alluded to early on, your journey into photography was sparked by this desire to take action on an environmental issue that you felt strongly about. And I know that you're clearly an active environmental advocate. I'm curious how you've been able to weave that into your photography and why that's been so important for you. And I'm also curious if that's something you're going to try to do with this book as well.
I am. And I want to go to another image, and then I want to read the essay that goes, or the caption that goes along with this image, okay? There's the first image that I've shown you from this section of the book, okay? And there are a number of other images of trees with their titles and captions. And then I have this one, okay?
It seems pretty clear to me the direction that you're heading with this.
Okay, let me read you the caption that goes along with this one. I title this Fog Pickup Sticks. I seek beauty and compositional interest in my photographs. In this image, I find fascinating geometric lines on the foggy morning in the standing and leaning trees. I see compositional strength in the photograph. I see no beauty in the subject matter itself. Forests tend to be inherently beautiful. This is not a forest. It's an outdoor, raw lumber factory. Timber companies have coined the terms working forests and tree farms, two cleverly devised semantic deceptions for places like this, to make them sound appealing, worthwhile, perfectly maintained. Instead, trees are grown to maximize speed until cut down for their monetary value. Collectively, they have no ability to support wildlife, to sequester carbon, or to provide the beauty a real forest imparts. None of that matters to the timber companies. The inherent values of any forest are ignored. Profit is the goal. If left to its own devices, this too can become a forest. It could take 100 to 300 years, maybe more, but it can slowly evolve into a forest, one that supports mosses, ferns, bushes, and other ground foliage, that contains tree species diversity, that supports wildlife, that sequesters carbon, that protects against erosion, that is richly beautiful to behold. Will we allow this outdoor lumber factory to become a real forest?
I love that you're making some statements with your images in this way. I mean, without having you read that, as soon as you transitioned to this image, I got a sense of kind of the direction you were going in terms of contrasting that beautiful forest with the bridge with this image that, while, like you said, compositionally it's very strong, it also imparts a message of destruction and of human interaction with the forest that has tainted it. And so I commend you for doing that. I think that is alone, I think, is going to make your book stand apart if you're able to do that with regularity throughout the book.
Well, to me, the book is really a combination of the images and the words, and together, I think it truly would be my magnum opus. I think that it has, hopefully, a great deal of beauty in it, which is really what I'm looking for in my photography. But also, there's an important message, and it's a soft message. That particular caption was about as hard a punch as I've put into words. And I believe that the imagery here is about as hard a punch as I could put into imagery, but it is part of the book, definitely part of the book. Let me jump to just a few more images that would be in the coming book.
Yes. It's quite a bit different than any of the other images so far because it's almost completely man-made structure.
It is completely man-made. This is the flooded crypt of Winchester Cathedral in England.
How does this fit in into your book?
Well, you'd have to see the book because they're
Oh, you're gonna do that. I see.
well. I mean, there's too much. The way that the landscapes segue into the tree or forest images, and the way those segue into man-made images, and the way those segue into slit canyon images, and the way slit canyon images segue into something else, basically a set of abstract and close-up images. So here is one, and this particular image that I'm showing right now that I call Antelope Canyon Rhythms is the photograph that I've chosen to be the book cover.
So if I were to try to encapsulate the direction you're going with this, is that it seems like there are metaphorical themes that are kind of woven together in a thread throughout the book that you're just gonna have to wait and see when you buy the book.
In a sense, that's true. I mean, basically, what I've done in rediscovering all of these images, like the previous one in Winchester Cathedral or this one in Antelope Canyon, I'm basically going through my lifetime of photography and then putting them together in some sort of a, hopefully, logical sequence that does lead from A to B to C to D and so on and so forth through the book, with hopefully lots of surprises in there, but hopefully a continuous thread that actually makes sense.
All right, let's see some more.
Okay, some like this one are about as abstract as anything could be, intentionally so. The idea is that some people would look at a photograph like this and want to go to the next page as quickly as possible. Other people may look at something like this and say, "My heavens, what am I looking at?" and try to solve what it is. Some of them
That's
may
me.
not.
I want to solve it.
No. And hopefully the people who are interested in the image, whether they solve it or not, are still willing to keep looking at it because they find the imagery fascinating, whether they could figure it out or not. So in essence, I'm putting a puzzle in front of the viewer. And some people will figure it out and some people won't. But hopefully the people, even who won't figure it out, will find it visually interesting and stimulating. So that's what I'm seeking right there. Here's another one.
They both work in that regard. I'm one of those people, though. I like looking at those puzzles, and I try to figure out, what am I looking at? Well, I guess in two ways. I'm trying to figure out, okay, what am I looking at, literally, but also what else is it? What is the photographer trying to say with this image? And I think that is what's so fun about abstract photography like this, is that it can be so stimulating in that way. Other people, like you said, other people might look at it and go, wow, it's mud and water with some reflected light. But it's certainly a lot more than that.
Yeah, and that, of course, in this case, is exactly what it is. Um, and some people don't even figure that part out. But it's an issue that a lot of people, when they cannot figure it out, their reaction is, "I don't know and I don't care." And hopefully, there is enough visual interest that I get enough people to say, "I don't know, but I'm still fascinated," rather than "I don't
Mm-hmm.
care."
Mm-hmm.
So there will
Right,
be
right, right.
abstracts, there will be non-abstracts. Here's another.
Beautiful.
And
Yeah, for those of
it
you
makes
listening
me,
on the audio only podcast, you're just gonna have to watch the YouTube.
just to show you how the book is related. Something like this, which only the viewers can see, uh, is followed. The very next image in the book is this.
Yeah, which is interesting because you've got two completely different subjects. You know, one is stone, like I think I'm assuming that's like some sandstone wall or something, and then the next image is corn lily leaves in black and white, but they all both convey kind of a message of pattern and tonality that are very similar.
The biggest surprise of all to me was when I started coming across one set of images that I had completely forgotten about, though they were related to the images that I have in the third section of my very first book, Visual Symphony. And that is a section that was called Urban Geometrics. But while I was making those photographs, there were a number of images that I made primarily in downtown areas of cities that I did not put in the book and completely forgot about. And these were even more wild and more enigmatic. And at some point, I just actually took these out as a separate issue, and they're together in this hopefully upcoming book under the title of Urban Enigmas. So let me just go through 5 of them that I've pulled off to the side and just show you this set that took me by surprise, and then I've included several new ones that I've made recently, having been self-inspired, you might say, to go back and do some more of these images that were made in the downtown areas of cities. So this is number 1 of those. And again, Matt, if you have any comments or questions, let me know.
Yeah, I mean, maybe for the benefit of the listeners, I can describe the image really quickly if you could go back to it. I'm just guessing, but it looks like we're looking at some kind of large building of glass but the glass is not perfectly even. It's almost like the glass is warped in some way. And so it's reflecting back a scene behind the photographer that is all warped and distorted, and it's very interesting, and it's got this grid-like pattern from the windows, and it's almost like you're looking into this distorted warp portal of different universes or something like that. Is that accurate?
Very accurate. Very, very accurate.
Yeah, let's keep going. And then this one almost looks like you photographed this from, it seems like it's from like an incomplete structure. I know it probably isn't, but it almost has that feeling like you're in a construction zone and you're looking out into a cityscape. And what's most interesting about it is that it has all of these sections of different patterns. So you have these crisscrossing lines, you have these dihedrons or rhododendron. Well, I don't know what are those. That name of that shape is the rectangle on its side, the diamonds, the pattern of diamonds, and then across from that you have totally different patterns as well. So it's like you've just taken this set of buildings and you've created all these different patterns with visual interest, which is really neat. But not just patterns, but also gradations of light, which is super interesting.
Mm-hmm.
And then another one, it's lots of patterns, lots of lines, lots of glass, lots of reflections and double reflections, and a very interesting image.
Yeah, I mean, basically, that's why I'm calling them urban enigmas.
Yeah, and this one It's almost as if you're outside of a building looking in through the glass, so you can sort of see the reflections of the street behind you, and you can sort of see what's inside the building, but not quite both. It's very cool.
Yeah, it's really designed to be confusing.
It works. And then this one, again, you have really interesting swirly twirly patterns on the left that I have no idea what created those. That's fascinating. And then you have another regular kind of windowed side of a building that has another reflection of a whole other area. So I think you're onto something with these, Bruce.
I think I am too, and three of those that I just showed were actually new ones. This one and the first one that I showed were actually those made 30 plus years ago, and inspired me to go back and see what I could start seeing again, having been, like I say, self-inspired by these. So it's very interesting to me. I feel that I am and always have been in an area of creativity, and I feel that it's hard to be in a better area than that.
Absolutely. Well, Bruce, maybe this is a great place to kind of land the plane here, so to speak. I have one more question for you, and it's always one of my favorite ones to ask people who have been in the industry for a while, and that is, who do you recommend our listeners learn more about? Who are some photographers that have inspired you?
Well, initially, of course, it was Ansel Adams. His landscapes were what drew me into photography, because I felt that of all the people who did landscape photography, he was the guy who really got it. You know, I mean, he understood the landscape in a way, I guess, that I did without really knowing the landscape that much before seeing his photographs. So he was my initial main inspiration. Brett Weston was a dramatic inspiration to me, because Brett Weston did abstract work, and I had been kind of pushing toward abstraction, but I knew that early in my career that when I was showing abstracts to anybody, their reaction was clearly, I don't know and I don't care, and I'd rather see a photograph of a mountain or a tree or a rock, and stop showing me these abstracts. And I shied away from it. And in 1979, with the two of my co-instructors, Ray McSavany and John Sexton, we took the whole group of students to Brett Weston's house. And he showed a number of photographs, and every one of them was abstract. And quite honestly, when I walked into his house, my feeling about abstraction was that it's something that tends to irritate people. And when I walked out of his house, my feeling about abstraction was it's putting a puzzle in front of people, and they either solve it or they don't. And my complete reaction to abstraction changed right there. And I stopped hesitating to show abstraction, and that happened within an hour and a half. So that was a huge, huge influence on my life. And let me name one other photographer, number three, and that is Ray McSavany, who I did workshops with for many, many years. He was a great photographer. He died a few years ago of cancer, unfortunately. But working with Ray and seeing his photographs and learning that method of controlling high contrast from him and all sorts of things, Ray was a huge inspiration to me.
And then what about anyone who's still around?
Several. I mean, I think that anybody who's seen the work of Sebastião Salgado will have to be inspired by his work. It's magnificent work, Brazilian photographer. And if anybody has seen the wildlife photography of Nick Brandt, just phenomenal. There are many others. There are certainly many others. but let me just name those two as people who are doing marvelous work today.
All right. Well, Bruce, this has been really fun. Thank you for being the very first person to push the envelope with this technology on Riverside. I think it's cool that you were actually to show your images on the screen, and hopefully that translates. And I have some editing that I get to do for the first time that I've never tried before. So thank you for pushing me to become a better podcaster.
Well, thank you. Thank you for inviting me over. And if you want to talk again, we could do it again sometime.
I love it. Well, thank you to Bruce for that great conversation and for sharing your life's work with us. I really appreciate it a lot. I hope that listeners will join me in supporting Bruce's book when it becomes available for pre-sale, as I think it will be chock full of inspiration. That's what I love most about hosting this podcast. Not only do I get to learn from some of the world's most inspirational artists, but I also get to help foster a community that supports each other in a positive way. Thank you to everyone who is taking part. That's all for now. Thanks for stopping in, collaborating with us, and listening. See you next week.